provide some closing remarks along with our facilitator, Alexander. And I'd like to, I think you've met most of the people up on the panel here, Dahlia, Celia, Alexandra, and Shane. And the thing that's interesting about them is that they were all in different breakout sessions. So I'd like to start by asking the panel if there were maybe 2 innovations that you saw in the breakout sessions that were particularly interesting, particularly promising, that others should know about, that we might be able to take forward. And maybe start at the end with Dahlia and come on down.
Okay. Hello, everyone. 2 innovation from my breakout session. Yeah. Dia País is the first one because it's totally linked with the process of the agreement peace in Colombia, and it's really interesting initiative promoted by the Los Andes community. It's a university, and they take one day whole classes of the university every year to talk about peace, how they can achieve all the agreement of peace, and share different ideas, projects, and initiatives, and at the same time inform the community about the different targets of the agreement of peace. So I think it's an amazing idea to promote peace, to understand between different points of view what is the main goal of this agreement, and trying to find different ways to achieve a solid peace, not just talking about peace and not feeling in peace, is achieve a real peace in whole the country after this agreement. And the other one, it's linked, of course, with environment, because I, as environmentalist, feel passionate with all this kind of initiative, is the Decolonize in Kenya. It's a campaign that means to stop coal investment in Kenya, targeting a stopping of a coal plant in Lamu, a UNESCO site. So far gained a national support from different countries. So that are the 2 good initiatives that I want to share with you, and I share it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had the pleasure of moderating the session on gender equality and women's empowerment as it relates to this nexus of natural resources and conflict prevention. So the 2 main innovations, I'm not sure we can really call them innovations, but I thought the 2 main interesting points that came out of our discussion were from 2 organizations that are working very closely with the community level. And really this notion of shifting our focus directly to the community level and away from our typical government partners who may very well be even sort of feminist elites, but they are elites speaking and using the space of communities. So shifting that focus both from a research perspective and from a practice perspective to the community allows us to hear more voices and more nuance in the voices that we hear, and highlights the importance of this notion of intersectionality as it relates to gender. Is that that women are not all the same, and that when we focus on gender equality and women's empowerment, we also need to understand the differences between groups of women as it relates to their ethnicity, to their social and economic class, etc. So I think we had great examples of initiatives that are really seeking to get into that much deeper and more granular level of understanding of who constitutes what part of the community and how to support those specific groups that need more of a voice and more empowerment. The second, if you'll allow me, I'll just use this to talk about a little bit about the program that I manage. We didn't talk about it so much in the session, but I think it is a good example of within the UN system how different agencies with different mandates and different expertise can come together and work each from their own perspective on a really complicated set of issues. So the program that I manage is on women, natural resources, and peace. And 4 organizations, UN Environment, UNDP, UN Women, and the Peace Building Support Office, have all sort of come together as one, not only to understand how we work from a conceptual point of view on integrating these different themes, but also very practically from an operational point of view. How do we, in the field, work jointly as 3 or 4 different organizations with different mandates on addressing some of these really complex issues in an integrated and holistic way. So I think I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about that, but I think that's also a good example. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm Alexandra Gil. I was facilitating the session on participatory environmental monitoring committees and how they can influence the decision-making process. I'm also not sure I can name it innovations, but rather new partnerships that are arising in the field of environmental monitoring committees that seem to be very helpful and useful. So we have heard an example from Flaviano, and I also brought one on community radios and local radios that serve first to make the community aware of the existence as such of the participatory environmental monitoring committees that sometimes are not known by the communities, to inform the community about their work, about how do they monitor and why do they monitor and for what purposes. They serve also to transmit and to help interpret the results and the actions to be taken after the monitoring to the communities that might not necessarily understand about it. And actually, they can even help the environmental monitoring committees to take decisions. I was talking about an anecdote from Argentina, in which in a radio they were denouncing the fact that one of the monitoring committees was choosing the samples from the places from where taking the samples of water and soil without having consulted the community. So this guy was denouncing this on the radio, and the person in charge of the monitoring committee called the radio back and asked him to tell him where did he want the samples to be taken from. So he took note, and those places are now also part of the sample points that they used to do the monitoring. And finally, also community radios and local radios help creating trust through this better communication and this transparency, so to say. The second innovative partnership or new actors that are coming to stage in participatory environmental monitoring committees work are third parties, impartial parties that can play a sort of verification role. They can be NGOs, civil society organizations, universities. They check results to make sure that they are correct, because sometimes there are these doubts when it is the enterprise that is paying the monitoring committee and paying also the person who checks in the laboratory the results. So these universities, and through partnerships with universities we have mentioned during the session, and with partnerships with NGOs, they act as third parties to verify the results and to make a sort of internal audit to check that they are correct.
Okay, an innovation from the breakout session. I think we can, for my part, I think I was in the session on assessing rule of law in mining sector governance. And we concentrated very much on a methodology that we had developed quite a few years ago on, zooming in on specific rule of law principles that are important for decision-making, the legality of decision-making when it comes to citizens' requests for claims on land registration, seeking building permits, legal identity in general. We had tested this methodology on quite a number of occasions over the years in different countries, and primarily we've had a big project when I was a consultant before, working at Folke Bernadotte Academy in Ukraine, looking at services, zooming in on the front office and seeing what kind of dilemmas, rule of law dilemmas that arise from that problem analysis. But to lift it into mining sector governance, for me, was the first time now. I've been working on it a little bit and trying to develop this toolkit in line with those aspects. But this is the first time in the room that we had people from all these different projects and to be able to and as well as people from outside, so we could suddenly bring it out into the cold light of day and to hear criticism back on that level. And as we know about toolkits, there are a lot of them out there, but what makes this one different? And suddenly, it kind of dawns on me that we talk about, what we're aiming towards with integrated approaches here, but we've already come quite a long way with this process, actually. Now it's the question of taking it to the next stage. When we first took it and applied it into this UNDP project, it was like trying to put talking about square pegs and round holes. And then the adaptation process was extremely interesting. And I think a lot of people involved in that, they really contributed in many different ways. And it's not often the case that, very much adapting it to the local context, looking at different institutions, being original in our thinking and trying to apply fresh ideas with a framework and to see what came out of that instead of just applying a blanket solution, which, as we all know, usually doesn't work. And it's probably contributing, more negatively than positively. So to be able to think outside the box and to say, well, if it's worked here, maybe it could work here, but and to see the weaknesses and the strengths as you move forward and try to adapt, I think that's, for me, that's what I think it's what we all aspire to, but often don't really achieve. So that, for me, was probably the biggest kind of eye-opener in the breakout session.
Great. And if we could maybe now talk a little bit looking forward, where do we go from here? How do we scale up these different approaches? What are barriers? And how do we get past those barriers? And you can focus on the approach that you mentioned, or on more broadly on some of the things that you've been hearing through the day.
Well, in different presentation in whole day, we have been talking about training. So I think that we need and have to promote training to encourage the local communities and civil society to be more active, especially in the decision-making spaces at national, local, and of course, and international level. We need to be involved in the future of our countries. We can do that if we don't participate directly in the process of the creation of new policies or new laws. Also, I think that we have to keep working in this way. I mean, working towards to achieve transparency in environmental governments. I think that this is one of the most biggest goals that we have, transparency in environmental governments. There are many countries where the people don't have any idea about the environmental damage or impact of the different activities of extractive sector. By example, in my country, we don't have any data. The only data that we have is the data that we as civil society make, and it's really difficult. At the same time, we have to promote more spaces like this one, and I want to thanks to the UNDP, to Stockholm, and all the people involved in the coordination of this event, because I think that it's a special and perfect place to share our knowledge and at the same time try to get information and ideas to other NGOs, countries, and people, and try to adapt this in our countries depending of our culture, economical realities, and etc., etc. And as last one, I want to say that we have to keep working, even if we think that everything is going on hard every day. We have to keep working on this, because at the end, everything passed, the good and the bad things. And yeah, we should strengthen the different networks, and we have to learn to work in network. We are not the only person working in this kind of issues in our country or in our region. There are many NGOs and different networks that have more knowledge maybe, or maybe have things that we need. So learn to work in network, it's necessary too. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would definitely second the notion that we need to promote more spaces such as this one. I think we're just beginning to understand what integration is all about, and we've heard today that there are a lot of positive examples, a lot of initiatives that are going in the right direction, and a lot of examples of good practices and good partnerships. But I think we still need to have a lot more discussion around this, and to continue sharing those examples and continuing inspiring each other to move forward in this direction. I'd really like to shift the onus, though, on donor governments. I mean, let's face it, donor governments, at least for now, shape development policy, and they decide what gets done in the number of countries that we work in. What they want, we do. And it may not be exactly the best practice, but that is the name of the game. So I think it's important that donors get behind this agenda, politically speaking, become or continue to be political champions, and Sweden is, of course, a prime example of this, but champions of integration, and use the incentives that are within their power, essentially, to make funding and investment and support conditional to adopting these kinds of approaches, whether it's conditional to funding, effective and real partnerships that go beyond having several logos on a page, but more in the direction of actual operational partnerships, or whether it's more in the direction of programs that integrate these issues effectively on the ground. I think donor governments have immense power in the system. I don't think we like to, in the UN system, admit how much power they have, but they do. And the leadership is going to come from there, in large part, in shifting our practices.
Thank you. So, in terms of the key measures, I asked Flaviano at the end of the session for a recipe, for a quick recipe for participatory environmental monitoring committees to really influence the decision-making process. And he answered with 2 keywords that are transparency and effectiveness. So transparency, in a way, should be or could be adapted not only to the companies, but also to the government and to the communities. We have been mentioning cases in which the communication of the results goes, for instance, from the government that is doing the monitoring to the mining company without the community being aware of, but also from the monitoring committee to the mining company without being accountable to the community, and the community is not aware of the results of the monitoring committee. So this is, in terms of transparency, a challenge that we have to find a solution for. In terms of effectiveness, there is a need for follow-up, for practice, and we've seen good examples of training that can help effectiveness, following the example of Peru, for instance, where training is provided by the government and from government officials, so that monitoring committees and the members of the monitoring committees follow the rules established in the environmental impact assessment, and they know exactly what parameters they have to measure, and that can be comparable widely in the whole country, so that they meet the requirements of the law in Peru, for instance. In terms of next steps, I think we need to work more on planning. For example, we've been seeing examples in which monitoring committees are reactive and they only monitor after hazardous events, or they only monitor when the person from the NGO comes from the capital, that is once every 3 months or once a year. So we need to ensure that there is a proper planning, and also to ensure sustained location of fundings for the monitoring committees, so that their activity is not reactive anymore, not only in terms of reacting to hazardous events, but also that ensuring that they can be created as soon as the approval of a mining company to arrive or to be installed in their zone is established, and even to participate prior to the arrival of the company in environmental and in socioeconomic impact assessments.
this is a hard question. If I think about like scaling up from small initiatives, and do we want to look at like 100 million crown projects, or and yeah, I'm just trying to think to what size you want to scale up. So, I mean, with this, and now I'll go back to this methodology that we were looking at, that we started off very small, extremely small. I'd never worked with a project with so little funding, but the idea was good. So, it's those kind of thinking outside the box, being a little bit innovative. I know I'm probably going back to the first point again, but it's all linked together. And I think that, and from there, and here, like, when you were talking about donors as well, and I think we can take it a little bit with a pinch of salt as well. I understand that you absolutely have to see how you align with donor priorities, but at the same time, I mean, the value add of this methodology that we worked with was because of the demand and the interest from the ground as well, from the government officials, local governance officials, CSOs on the ground, that really saw relevance of this type of work that was maybe not all that prevalent in certain areas. So I don't know, maybe we were right, or we got lucky, but we managed to come at the right time and look at specific problem analysis like this, what we were looking at on this rule of law public administration. So I think we shouldn't be afraid to think maybe we can complement other ongoing programs. Maybe we can adapt as we go along. I mean, although it's always, of course, very nice to have large-scale programs where you have your idea at the center of it, but I think we should be ready to take a step back and say, okay, so like what's already happening on the ground, and then see how we can kind of tie into that. Or also, to be ready to say, well, maybe it's not so relevant here in this country in this reform process right now. And, although, then we'll probably get like criticism for not accepting the funding when it's laid on the plate for us. So yeah, these are some of the dilemmas we have to handle as implementers of development assistance or in this area. So yeah, I'll leave it there actually.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Alexander up if you would like to share a few words on what you've heard, and in terms of the big picture and where do we go way forward.
Thank you. My iPad should turn, otherwise I can't read it. There we go. Thank you. I was just thinking what to add to everything that has been said here, and I think what I'll mention here is just a kind of personal reflection on something I've seen in the past weeks when I was working on this. I studied human geography of developing countries in the 1980s. And in those days, we had just left behind the notion that the countries, what we then called the third world countries, were just behind, they had kind of missed the train, had to take the next train to catch up with where we were, and that you actually needed to do things differently. But it was very one-dimensional. There were all these different schools, like, let's build a lot of infrastructure. Once you got good infrastructure, everything will work. Or it was like just a very technological approach to agriculture. So if you just improve the harvest, then everything would work. And we were then slowly at the phase that, yeah, it's actually rather difficult. We've tried now a few angles, and it doesn't work. Where are we? And I remember that my professor in one of the last classes that was really about this development of the thinking then said, well, actually, I believe that in the coming years, he said, and then now I'm talking about mid-1980s, I think access to resources, that's going to be the essential thing. And then he spoke a little bit about it, but it was very much at a kind of national level, the national government should get the rewards of the resources in the country, and then things would work. I'll hold the microphone closer to when I speak. So if you see where we are now, in the enormous complexity, even the step from the MDGs to the SDGs, how complex things are, how we have to work integrated on everything that we're tackling. We're only talking about resources here. We're only talking about actually a few projects. Monaca is still not helped by everything that we have done today. And we know that the cobalt that I mentioned, where I started with, that will be 30-fold in just 12 years' time. How are we going to scale this? And then I very much am with Celia Halle, who was just speaking on how do we get the donors involved? How do we get the donors really convinced that you need to tackle this multi-headed dragon in a very multifaceted, coordinated way? So that is very much what I take from here. And the main message is, we have seen that it works. We have seen all these wonderful examples. And then the next question is just, how are we going to scale it? It's a question of communication. It's a question of lobbying. It's a question of believing that it can be done. And it's a question of working together with those people that believe that it can be done. And that's basically everybody in the room, unless nobody paid attention, because it can be done. That's what we learned from today. You said, where are we going? Well, actually, we're going to Geneva in October, the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining. We have the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity in Egypt in November. But we're going back to Stockholm for talking about scaling this meeting, actually. Broadening it to broader, to national resources, but especially broadening the audience, get more involvement from business, and well, we still have to work out how to do it. And you should all be involved in that. Come with your ideas on what we should do different. Where do we need more time for? Where should we dig into? Somewhere in springtime, in September, we should be here. We should start to work on a kind of declaration where we put down our thoughts on what we want and where we want to go to and how we want to get there. I'll take the microphone a little bit later at the end, but Carl first has to say a few more words, I'm sure, on this. And then Martin Eriksson, the director of the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, would also like to say a few words. I'll first give back to you.
Thank you. And before I have my closing remarks, I wanted to just remind the speakers, if you have not already signed a release after this, please stop at the registration desk so that the organizers can share the recordings more broadly. I share Alexander's both interest and optimism. We're at a very interesting point. Several years ago, most of the discussions in this space were about the problems. We've learned a lot since then, and today's discussions reflect that growth. It's particularly noteworthy that we understand not only a lot about the dynamics and the challenges, but we have a growing understanding of what are the solutions and how do we do it. I'm not saying that we know what to do exactly. But we have a lot of understanding. We've tried this, it worked kind of here, it worked a lot better there. And with that, I'd like to focus on 4 key points in my closing remarks. First, conflict prevention depends on sound environmental governance, and sound sustainable environmental management relies on conflict prevention. You cannot have one without the other. And this is what is so exciting about the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't know how they teach sustainable development in other countries, but in the US, there are 3 pillars: social, environmental, and economic. The Sustainable Development Goals added a 4th: peace. You cannot have sustainable development without peace. And if you look at the indicators and everything, it's pretty weak. But it's, for the first time, the UN has declared formally and unambiguously that peace is essential to sustainable development. And this discussion today really highlights that. We have a growing body of evidence, and for on the ground, multiple levels, different regions, different dynamics, We see that land degradation, deforestation, and water shortages drive conflict and migration, and inequitable sharing of revenues and other benefits from oil, gas, and minerals drive conflict and secessionist movements. There's also a key linkage to human rights. Nature and the values that it provides to people underpin a wide range of human rights, from the rights to food, life, equality, water, culture, and depending on who you talk to, the human right to a healthy environment. Moreover, rights-based approaches, rule of law, and peaceful resolution of disputes are essential to both conflict prevention and environmental sustainability. One thing that has come up a number of times in the discussion today is the importance of power dynamics. Power dynamics are often at the core of environment, conflict, and peace. Because of that, one tool that we haven't talked a lot about, but I would like to highlight, is political economy analysis. We need to be understanding who has what interests in the resources. And as you make this policy choice or that policy choice, what are the implications for the different stakeholders? And with that, we often see the use of transparency as an equalizer, that by shining a light on some of the lack of equality or equity in power, that can help to equalize the dynamics. We also have seen discussions at different times about the challenges associated with protecting environmental and human rights. I love John Knox's quote mentioned earlier by Claudia, I think. Environmental human rights defenders are risking their today for our tomorrow. That's such a wonderful capturing of what's happening. The situations that we're dealing with are complex, and frankly, I find that to be so interesting. How often do you want to play tic-tac-toe? It's you know what the rules are very quickly, and it gets boring. This space, we don't know how all the pieces relate. We're still trying to figure it out. That's what makes it so interesting and so challenging, and when it works, so rewarding. And there are two big things that I think come out of today's discussion in that respect. One are the integrated approaches, and two are these innovative partnerships. That takes me to my second point. Integrated approaches are essential to achieving the 2030 agenda. And this integration applies across resource sectors. And sometimes, we work very much in our silos, the water sector, the environment sector, the energy sector. But we have seen, it's well established, this water, energy, food nexus, WEF. We also see, very clear linkages between water and extractives, between biodiversity and extractives, between agriculture and extractives. Extractives have a big footprint here. We also see the need to integrate across geographic scales. We've talked a lot about different scales today. We haven't talked that much about how they link. So how do things at the local level tie to the national level? Often it's, the national decision makers are removed from the communities. Okay, as a practical matter, how do you integrate? How do you feed in community decisions to the national level? How do you effectively decentralize? And how do we manage global drivers? A lot of the challenges in this space are because there's a strong global demand for the resources that is then pushing companies into new spaces for biofuels, for minerals, for timber. We also need to integrate temporally. Chris this morning was talking about thinking beyond the mine gate. It's not, you have to look through the whole value chain. Think about the project life cycle, the conflict life cycle. But so often we focus on our own little niche. We need to think about what happens before and what happens after, and how are these things linked? Integration is also about integrating among constituencies, and that really means, in many cases, a greater focus on gender, and on marginalized communities. And Florian had a wonderful framing of inclusion becomes empowerment. Should be noted, we talk about a lot of this, we need to do this, this is important. We also need to recognize that this takes time and effort. There are transaction costs. Projects are delayed because you need to take the time to consult. So we need to make the case for why this is important. That yes, it will be delayed, but it's going to be delayed even more with greater cost if you have protests, if the community shuts down the roads, if your investors get scared and because of the conflict. So yes, this takes time, but it's often the only path. Second point is that simply saying this is integration, and the fact that it is integration doesn't necessarily mean that it's effective integration. We need to be looking at what works. We need to build that evidence base to find out what's most effective and what's most efficient. And there's a tension there. I will readily admit that. Third, innovative partnerships that emphasize inclusion are necessary to tackling these multidimensional challenges and advancing these integrated nexus approaches. We've talked about a wide range of partners, governments, partner governments, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, private sector communities. I think that today's discussion does highlight that we need to really pay more attention to bringing in the private sector, that they are central to this, and at too many of these meetings, there aren't enough private sector people there. Now, is that because they've got better things to do with their time? Is that because they didn't know about this? Maybe there's a combination. But the fact is that one way or another, we really need to engage more effectively with the private sector. We need to be thinking about engagement in these partnerships early in the process. That's something that a number of people talked about. There's so many examples. I'm just going to quickly mention a couple, but they're so exciting to see the Just Gold initiative, which is providing conflict-free gold at competitive market prices, the community monitoring. I've used this sort of approach in different things, and people say, oh, that costs money, you can't do that. They don't have technical expertise. Well, we hear all the time, this can't be done. I love when somebody shows it's being done. And we need to learn about how did you overcome the technical barriers, how do you manage the cost, how do you manage sustainability, because those sorts of things are things that we really need. I think it's also interesting, Celia's comment about the UN program on women, natural resource, and peace. Increasingly, we see kind of this bridging within a broader bureaucracy across institutions, and how do we integrate, whether it's within the government or within the UN. This is really exciting. And then the role of community radio. I mean, how many people are talking about communications throughout this? Not enough. Every now and then it comes up that we need to communicate better. But this is, this was a very effective tool in many contexts. The fourth point, coming back to some of the other comments, is the real need to invest in these approaches. And the reality is, I live my life on soft money. If I get a grant, I can do the work. If I don't get the grant, I don't get to do it, no matter how much I want to do it. And this is the reality in the field for so many people. Sometimes you can do it on very little money, but you still need something for a certain cost that you cannot absorb through voluntary labor and such. And so one thing that I think is really important to think about is, how do we engage the security sector? You look at the budgets of the environment ministries, which tend to be fairly sympathetic to these linkages. And then you compare those budgets to the defense ministries. Man, If you could just get the pocket change from those defense ministries, that would go a long way. But we need to get them in the room, and we need to be convincing them that this is a real security risk. That when we talk about conflict, we're not just talking about protests. That this does tie into the various armed conflicts, violent conflicts that we see around the world. I'd like to offer one final thought. Just going back to the very beginning with Monica and others, this is heartbreaking. You see all the challenges, the profound challenges, and it's so easy to lose hope. It really is. Today's discussions give me a lot of hope. There are challenges, but we have heard voices from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, from the Americas, voices of people highlighting how time and again, dedicated individuals, a few individuals in a particular space can improve environmental sustainability, protect human rights, and prevent conflict. Just a few people working hard with limited resources, knowing that they are overcoming the limited resources, the threats of violence, often the acts of violence, and other barriers gives me hope. Knowing that we are developing, testing, and sharing innovative approaches gives me hope. And knowing that there are a lot of other people out there who are doing this work gives me hope. And so I would like to thank you for sharing your experiences and your enthusiasm, and to the conference organizers for bringing us together. Thank you.
The last two speakers, Martin Eriksson, will now say a few words, and then I'll do really a final talk.
Thank you. Martin Eriksson, Swedish EPA. At first, I really want to say thanks to all of you that have taken part in this event today and this dialogue that we have had. One aim with this day has been to establish a platform for learning from each other, exchange of experience, and cooperation within an integrated approach. I would like to say that this platforms and this learning from each other, cooperation, exchange of experience, partnerships, and integrated approaches between the different challenges is crucial for us. So for that we can do a good job with the big challenges that we have in front of us and that we are dealing with right now. It's not easy, and we can't do it ourselves. We have to cooperate. We have a lot to learn from each other and so on. We must see the interlinkages. We must handle the conflicts, and we must also find driving forces between the synergies that we can have between different challenges, because there are not only conflicts, there are also synergies, and to find them and get energy and driving forces with these synergies is very important. So we have a lot to learn from each other. I will also say, like you in your final remarks, that we also have a lot of energy to give to each other, and we need that. A day like this is a great vitamin injection, and that's also a good effect when we are doing this kind of things together, that we are giving each other energy and hope. Very important. Finally, I would like to promise also that the Swedish EPA will continue to work in this spirit within the SDG goals, the integrated approach and so on, and to develop the partnerships that we have, and also try to find new partnerships. There are still a lot of development to do also when it comes to cooperation in the international work. So, thank you all.
Thank you very much. So the only thing that's now between your drinks and and this conference, that is me. Just a few last, mainly logistical things. First of all the speakers have to, under Swedish law, sign that they are okay, that they've been filmed, and that is actually on the internet. And a few speakers haven't done that yet. I'm one of them, actually. So those speakers have to come to the registration desk and have to sign there, and I will do that as soon as possible. Also, for all the speakers, I'm not going to ask all of you individually on stage, but we have a present to thank you. But I'll just say here, I would like to thank all the speakers. Please come up directly after this. I'm not going to do a whole ceremony now. It's all going off time of your drinks, but do come up here. This is your present. Then I would like to thank the audience for being here and for being so interactive. Not in the first two sessions, but we skipped that for the afternoon, and then everybody was interactive. And you have to be more interactive at the drinks in 2 minutes from now. You've all been wonderful, and there is a number of people that I would like to thank. No. First, I want to say you will soon get a report of the conference. It will be sent to you, and you will get copies of all the presentations that you have seen today. And I would like to thank also the respondents that reacted to the speakers that we saw earlier today. And then there are some names I want to mention of the people that really made it possible today. I was just on stage saying hi to you and just announcing people. But there's actually a team of people that has spent an enormous amount of time on making all this possible. And I think they've done a wonderful job. And that is Tim Scott and Sanna Due. And here we have, sorry, I stayed to my list, otherwise I'm picking people in the crowd and I'm starting to miss people. So Ann Pedersen, Maria Bang, Silja Halle, Ludmila Saban, and Francisco De Villo. I would like to thank all of them. Maybe you should give them an applause. And that is also for Bengt Ikerin, that I see in the back, who's done a lot of the technical work, and all the other technicians that have helped us today. Everything worked, so that doesn't happen at all conferences, so I'm very happy that all worked. Of course, I would like to thank our host, the government of Sweden, and all the co-organizers, the Swedish EPA, the Volker Bernadotte Foundation, UN Environment, and UNDP. So last applause for all of them, and then we can go off to our drinks. So thanks very much for coming here.